The sun had burned for 3 straight days across the station platform, a merciless eye in a bleached white sky. The wooden boards were so hot they'd begun to splinter, blistering the bare feet of 7 children huddled together in a knot too tight for air. Their clothes were not just worn, but threadbare, hanging from their thin frames like rags on scarecrows. Faces were streaked with the kind of soot and coal dust that gets into the very lines of your skin, and their eyes were hollowed out by a hunger that steals more than sleep. It steals childhood itself. The eldest, a girl of maybe 13, clutched a cracked leather satchel to her chest. It wasn't a toy, it was a lifeline, the last rope tying them to a world that had already let go. Inside, I knew later, was a weathered Bible wrapped in a faded blue ribbon. Every time a stranger's shadow fell too close, her knuckles turned white around that satchel. The youngest, a boy of no more than 3, had whimpered against her lap until his voice frayed into a hoarse rasp, and now his silence was somehow worse than his crying. People walked by. They didn't just ignore them. They muttered. They judged. A woman in a fine dress whispered to her husband, "3 days and no kin's come forward." Pitiful. Another man quickened his stride, saying, "Best the county haul them off before disease sets in." They spoke as if the children were livestock, a problem to be managed. Some of the men even laughed when the youngest boy, his eyes wide with need, reached for a dropped crust of bread. Someone batted his tiny hand away like he was nothing more than a stray dog. Yet through it all they clung to each other, a tangled shield of bone and courage. I am Elias Red Feather, and I have carried this image in my heart for more years than I care to count. There are some sights a man wishes he could forget, but never can. And I tell you this, no jury of law, no judge in a black robe, ever sat heavier than that bench where 7 orphans waited to be seen by a world that refused to look. From the far end of the platform came the sound of boots, slow, measured, unhurried. A tall rancher, shoulders as broad as a barn beam, stood by a freight car, his hat pulled low over eyes that missed nothing. He had watched long enough. Dust streaked his shirt, his face shadowed by both sun and a deep, settled silence. But when the smallest child let out a dry, broken rattle of a cough, something inside that man shifted. He strode forward. Each step cut through the whispers of the crowd, his spurs clinking like steel punctuation in a sentence of pure defiance. Gasps rippled through the onlookers as he reached the children. He didn't say a word. He just bent low and swept the youngest into the crook of his left arm. Then he pulled 2 more against his chest, their small heads finding a place against his ribs. With one steady, powerful movement, he shifted the eldest girl, Hester, onto his back. He hooked 2 more small boys under the strength of his right arm, and finally he lifted the last one onto his hip. All 7 of them clung to him at once, like branches to a single, unshakable trunk. The crowd erupted. It was a storm of voices, a clash of outrage and awe. "Has he lost his mind?" one man cried. "He'll never keep them," another hissed. But others just went quiet, stunned into silence at the sight of one man carrying what the entire world had just declared a burden too heavy to bear. The eldest girl, her face pressed against the hard muscle of his back, whispered through cracked lips, her voice trembling. "Sir," she pleaded, "please don't leave one behind." It wasn't a command. It was a prayer, and his silence answered her louder than any oath ever could. The station master came barreling forward, his vest straining over a belly full of importance. His voice boomed over the murmurs. "Hold there. Those children aren't yours to claim." He sliced his hand through the air as if he could seize authority itself. But the rancher didn't flinch. His arms remained steady beneath the fragile, precious weight of 7 lives. I am Elias Red Feather. And in that moment the dust itself seemed to still. Because mercy, it moves slower than judgment, but when it comes, it bends the very air around it, and all who breathe it know the truth. That strength isn't proven in fists, or in land, or in money. It's proven in the arms that refuse to let go. The station master planted himself like a bull at a gate, sweat shining on his brow. He stood there, red-faced and furious, while the rancher stood with 7 children clinging to him. The cracked satchel was still trapped beneath the eldest girl's elbow, its blue ribbon peeking out like a small, stubborn vein of sky. "Put them down," the station master barked, his voice built to command timetables and freight, not mercy. "Until the county clerk rules, these miners' orphans are railway property." The word property scraped across the platform boards like nails on slate. A few men in the crowd nodded, as if the law were a warm blanket to pull up tight around their own comfort. Others flinched, as if the word itself were a whip to the back. The eldest girl, Hester, gathered herself. "I'm Hester," she said, her voice hoarse but steady. She pointed with her chin as she named them, each name a small act of war against the word property. Bram, Lenny, Sol, Prue, Thatch, and Jolie. Jolie coughed again, that dry, empty little cough, and tucked his face against the rancher's collar like a sparrow hiding under a roof beam. "Names don't change order," the station master snapped, slicing the air with a flat palm toward his office. "Telegraph's gone out. The sheriff will partition them by sundown. Until then, they remain in my custody." But just then another voice cut through the heat, slick and cold. Marek Cole, a rancher in title but a scavenger at heart, sauntered forward. His thumbs were hooked in his belt as if the whole platform and everything on it were his personal corral. "I'll claim the 3 oldest, lawful," he drawled, his smile as thin as a wire. "Fence posts don't set themselves. County will thank me for it." A few men made that sound men make when they like the taste of a plan that costs them nothing. Near the ticket wicket, an elderly widow shaded her eyes and leaned in. "That ribbon," she murmured, her voice papery but clear as a bell. "I stitched little crosses just like that for the church parcels last winter. Those boxes were bound for the Harrows Ford Clinic." The question hung in the air, unspoken but sharp. How does a clinic ribbon come to be tied around an orphan's Bible 2 towns away? The station master shot her a look meant to send a needle back to its cushion. "Mind your thread, Miss Pike. I am Elias Redfeather, and I have learned that knots are never cut by shouting. They come loose when one small truth is tugged by a hand everyone else was busy ignoring." The rancher shifted his hold and, with one careful, sweeping motion, he set the children down upon a bench. He kept his body positioned as a wall between them and the hungry eyes of the crowd. He crouched so his eyes met theirs, level and steady, as if he were taking a measurement only he needed to know. He said their names back to them, one by one. Bram, who tried on courage like a coat a little too big for his shoulders. Lenny, who tucked a stray braid behind her ear and refused to let go of Jolie. Sol, his lips moving as he silently counted the nails in the wooden slat beneath his fingers. Prue, who hugged the satchel as if it were breath itself. Thatch, his jaw set as if the wind itself had dared him to flinch. Jolie, his cough rasping in the heavy air. And finally, Hester, whose young shoulders held the weight of all 7 like a yoke she refused to drop. The station master signaled 2 of his railway men. One of them uncoiled a length of cord strung with tin tags, each one stamped with a number. "Marks," the master said briskly, "so they aren't lost when they're dispersed." The word dispersed slid through the platform like a cold draft under a door. Bram swatted the air as if at a wasp. "Don't tag my sisters," he said, his voice shaking but standing on its toes to sound tall. The rancher's hand settled on the boy's shoulder, a weight that steadied him without pinning him down. "If it's law you want," the rancher said, his voice even, his eyes locked on the master. Then let's start with truth. Show me the receipt that says the county fed them a single biscuit in 3 days. The station master's mouth pinched like a bad stitch. My work is order. Bread is the clerk's business. Inside the office, the telegraph key began to chatter. A young woman with ink-smudged fingers read the strip of paper, swallowed hard, and slid it out from beneath the wicket. The color climbed the station master's neck as he read the words aloud. Sheriff convenes placement hearing at sundown to divide wards by suitability and need. Merrick Cole's smile gleamed like a small, polished blade. There, I'll take Hester, Bram, and Sol. The rest can scatter where they scatter. Hester stood up, the blue ribbon trembling between her fingers. Our mama wrapped this around her Bible the night before we buried her, beyond the tracks, she said. She told us, the churchwoman sewed the cross. We ain't strays. We're hers. Agnes Pike lifted a thin, determined hand. I stitched that cross, she said, her voice steadying with the memory. If that ribbon came here on a freight bill instead of on a prayer, then something meant for the sick was sold along the way. Murmurs rose from the crowd, uneasy and thorned, a sound like brush hiding a snake. Sermons don't feed cattle, Marek said, bored with the shape of pity. The railway man reached forward with the tags. The rancher caught his wrist. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't loud. It was just iron enough to stop a train of habit. No tags, he said. No dispersing. The master drew a breath to roar, but just then a church bell tolled from town. One hard, clear note. The telegraph clacked again. Faster this time. The operator blanched. She whispered without meaning to. He's bringing the partition chain. The word chain hopped from ear to ear until even the steel rails themselves seemed to listen. The rancher straightened up, and for the first time he gave the platform his name. Calder, he said. I'll take these 7 to shade and bread until sundown. Any man who lays a tag on them before that hearing answers to me. He lifted Jolie and the satchel in one smooth motion. The others rose like a small tide around his boots. Merrick stepped directly into his path. His smile now turned to hard wire. You'll answer to the badge, Reed. I am Elias Redfeather, and mercy is not fangless. It simply chooses which throat to spare. Down the road, a dust plume rose, and inside it, the sun flashed on iron. The sheriff's wagon rattled into view, and coiled over its rail lay a length of dull metal, its tin numbers winking like little blind eyes as it bumped closer and closer to the platform's edge. The sheriff's wagon ground to a halt with the squeal of tired wheels, and the sight of that partition chain draped across its rail spread a hush heavier than any sermon bell. Tin tags dangled from it, each stamped with a number, each meant to sort flesh from flesh, the way a rancher marks cattle for the slaughterhouse. Sheriff Brandt climbed down slow, his boots measured, his eyes scanning the children with the weary calculation of a man who had long ago traded compassion for cold procedure. Calder Reed, he said, squinting as if the name itself carried dust. I've heard tales of your stubbornness. This isn't your fight. The crowd pressed closer, their faces a shifting sea of pity, curiosity, and a dark hunger for order to be restored. Merrick Cole's grin stretched wide, his voice loud enough for every soul to hear. Sheriff, the county needs hands, not mouths. I'll take the 3 oldest, feed 'em, work 'em. The rest can be scattered where they won't starve in one man's kitchen. You know I have the acres to make good use of them. He swept his arm as if presenting a herd at market, his eyes bright with a sense of ownership before the claim was even settled. The children pressed together, a single trembling unit. Prue clutched the satchel so tightly the old leather creaked in protest. Sol whispered a count under his breath, 1, 2, 3, like prayer beads against the coming storm. Bram stepped forward, his small fists clenched, though his knees knocked together. Hester found her voice, thin but steady as a wire. "We're not fence posts," she said. "We are mamas." She raised the ribboned Bible high, and the cross stitched by Agnes Pike gleamed faintly in the harsh sun. "I am Elias Redfeather. I have seen many crowds lean toward the loudest voice, but sometimes the smallest mouth, cracked and dry, can tilt the weight of an entire town." The sheriff's jaw tightened, but his eyes never softened. "The law's clear," he said, his voice flat. "Without papers, kin or deed, they belong to the county, to be placed where the town decides is best." Marek stepped closer, his shadow falling over the children like a net. "Then place them with me," he pressed. "Strong backs, empty bellies. They'll earn their keep. Reed can't even feed 7 with his own herd, dying in this drought." Laughter sparked, quick and cutting, from a knot of men who always laughed when Merrick did. Calder adjusted the youngest, Jolie, higher against his chest. He finally spoke, his voice low, but carrying like the rumble of distant thunder. 3 days they waited, and not a single county hand brought them bread. 3 days, and not one man here claimed responsibility. You talk of order, Sheriff, but order abandoned them first. His words stirred a ripple of unease, a flicker of shame that bent a few heads, though others just sneered deeper to hide it. Merrick leaned in close enough that only those nearest could smell the sour whiskey on his breath. "You'll ruin yourself on sentiment, Reed. No herd can fatten on pity. When you fail, I'll be waiting to gather what's left, them included." Calder turned his gaze back to the sheriff. "If the law is so eager to weigh them, then let it weigh more than numbers on a tag. Let it weigh the truth of what they've carried." He nodded to Hester, who still held the Bible aloft with trembling arms. "This satchel is their proof. And if the law burns it, the law burns them, too." The sheriff's eyes flickered. It was the faintest crack in the iron. But Merrick barked a harsh laugh, dragging the moment back to his side. "Proof, it's paper and ribbon. Feed them on sermons, Reed, and see how long it is before they drop dead in your yard. I'll take them tonight and have them working by dawn." The children whimpered as Merrick reached toward them, his fingers spread wide. Calder's boot shifted, planting himself squarely between the children and the grasping farmer, his shoulders filling the space like a barricade of solid rock. Gasps sparked through the crowd. Whispers raced like fire through dry grass. "He'll fight the sheriff. He's gone mad." "I am Elias Redfeather. I have always known that mercy is mistaken for weakness, right up until the moment it bares its teeth. And that day, Calder Reed's silence carried more danger than all of Merrick Cole's laughter. Because in that pause, the whole town understood that a line had just been drawn in the dust, and someone was about to cross it. The platform cracked open into chaos the moment Calder Reed shifted his weight. It wasn't with violence, but with pure, unshakable decision, and the sound of it rippled louder than a gunshot. He swept the youngest child back into the crook of his arm, steadied Hester with his free hand, and herded the rest of them toward the worn-out wagon waiting at the road's edge. The children stumbled, their thin legs weak from hunger, but they clung to him like shadows, clutching the satchel between them so tight its leather squealed. Merrick Cole lunged, his hand outstretched to seize Soul by the collar. But Calder swung his body like a heavy gate, the heel of his palm knocking Merrick aside without a single word. The crowd gasped as Merrick fell back, dust streaking his fine coat, his curses sharp as thorns in the sudden silence. Sheriff Brandt barked for order, his hand hovering near the revolver on his belt, but hesitation clung to him like sweat. The law demanded he act. Yet the sight of 7 desperate children pressed against one man's unyielding frame made him pause. "I am Elias Redfeather. There are moments when the law stands taller than any man, and then there are moments when the law shrinks beneath the weight of a single human choice. This was one of the latter. Calder lifted Jolie into the wagon bed, then hoisted the others after him, his arms moving with the certainty of a man branding calves. But these were no calves. They were souls with names he already carried in his chest. He climbed onto the bench, seized the reins, and with a sharp snap, the horses lurched forward, their iron-shod hooves throwing sparks against the hard-packed ruts. The wagon jolted hard, and the children cried out in a chorus, more pitiful than any hymn. Behind them, Merrick scrambled to his feet, shouting to his men, "Mount up! After him! He won't make it to the ridge!" Several riders spurred their horses, dust plumes rising like storm clouds. The partition chain still rattled in the sheriff's wagon, as if it were eager to be used. The townfolk spilled into the road, some shouting encouragement, others jeering, but none willing to step between the chase. Hester clutched the satchel tight against her ribs, whispering a litany only her siblings could understand. Names, memories, fragments of a mother buried without a marker. Bram, seated beside her, balled his fists and muttered, "I'll fight him if he comes close." Prue buried her face against Hester's shoulder, her tears soaking into the thin fabric of her dress. Calder's jaw was a clenched line of granite, his eyes fixed on the road ahead as it narrowed into the canyon path. "Hold on," he said, his voice low but steady enough to cut through their fear. "Don't look back." It wasn't a promise. It was a command born of pure survival. Behind them, the riders were closing in, their cruel laughter slicing the air. Marek's voice carried, sure and mocking. "Run, Reed. You'll starve with them, or you'll hang for theft, but you won't keep them." Calder snapped the reins harder. The horses strained, their nostrils flaring, the wheels of the wagon bouncing dangerously near the canyon's edge. Stones clattered down the steep slope into emptiness, a stark warning of how narrow the path to safety had grown. The children clutched each other, Sol counting louder and louder under his breath, as if the numbers themselves could stitch courage into the air. Lenny whispered prayers she only half remembered from her mama's voice. "I am Elias Redfeather." And that day the land itself leaned close, holding its breath. For even earth and stone know the weight of 7 lives balanced on a wheel's edge. The sound of pursuit thickened, the hooves hammering like war drums against the dry ground. The canyon walls echoed every strike until it seemed a whole army was following them into the dust. Jolie coughed, a rasp that rattled his whole thin chest, and Calder reached one hand back to steady him without ever loosening his grip on the reins. Ahead, the canyon curved tight, and the road split. One path led out toward the open plains and his ranch. The other led back toward town and its waiting judgment. Calder pulled the reins. He didn't choose safety. He chose confrontation. He steered the wagon back toward the distant spire where the church bell could be seen, faintly over the rooftops. Gasps burst from the children. Bram cried out, his voice filled with betrayal. "You're going back!" Calder's eyes burned from beneath the brim of his hat. I said, "Hold on. If they want to weigh us, we'll make them weigh everything." The wagon roared down the slope, dust veiling it in a swirling cloak, while behind them, Marek's riders howled, scenting what they thought was a trapped animal. "I am Elias Redfeather." And so Mercy fled, not into hiding, but straight into the jaws of the very law that sought to devour it, carrying 7 souls and one man's unbreakable silence like a banner that none of them could ignore. The wagon thundered back into town, the riders close behind, their jeers braiding with the iron clang of hooves until the whole street seemed to shake with the coming storm. Folks spilled from their doorways, drawn by the chaos of dust and voices. When Calder reined the horses to a lurching stop right before the courthouse steps, the 7 children clutched him like castaways gripping the last plank of a shipwreck. Sheriff Brant was already there, broad and immovable. The partition chain was now looped over his shoulder like a priest's stole, a sacrament of cold, hard law. His voice boomed, heavy with the kind of authority that men so often mistake for justice. Calder Reed, you have seized county wards without claim or paper. By law, they will be returned to my custody and shall be divided before sundown. The crowd hummed its approval, a low murmur hungry for order. Marek Cole dismounted, his swagger thick with triumph, and he spread his hands wide. You hear the sheriff, Reed. You've got no kin here, no deed tying you to these strays. But I'll give them a roof, and I'll give them work. That's more than your pity can offer. His eyes roved over Hester and Bram as though he were appraising livestock. He added with a smirk, the strong ones will earn their keep quick enough. Hester stiffened, clutching the satchel against her ribs, the blue ribbon trembling. Bram pressed forward, his fists small but white-knuckled. Calder swung down from the wagon and stood before them, dust rising like a veil around his boots. His silence was a wall, broken only when Jolie's sharp cough rattled the sudden hush. Then Calder spoke, his voice not raised but steady as stone. 3 days these children sat on your platform. If they were the county's concern, they'd have bread in their bellies and water at their lips. If they were this town's burden, then shame falls on every single man here who walked past them and looked away. You talk of law, Sheriff. I talk of neglect. I am Elias Redfeather. It is a strange thing to hear mercy make its case, for it needs no ledger, no seal, only the courage to hold up a mirror before men who would much rather look away. The sheriff's jaw flexed, but his hand tightened on the chain. Your intentions don't matter, Reed. Order matters. If every man seized what his heart pitied, we'd have chaos. Marek barked a laugh. There, sense at last. Chaos is 7 mouths that Calder Reed can't feed. His mercy has turned to weakness. Give them to me, Sheriff, and I'll put them to use. The children whimpered, and Sol began to count under his breath again, faster this time, as if his numbers could outpace fate. Prue clung to Hester's skirt, while Lenny whispered, Mama's book. Show them, Hester. Show them. Hester rose, trembling, and she lifted the Bible high so all could see. The ribbon was frayed, but the cross was still stitched true. This is ours, she said, her voice breaking but clear. Mama's hands held it. We buried her with no marker but dirt. This is the proof that we're hers, and that we belong together. The crowd hushed, and a prickle of shame touched even those who had scoffed the loudest. But Marek spat into the dust. A book don't bind a family. Paper's not kin. Burn it, and be done with this. Sheriff Brant's eyes flickered as he took the Bible, his thumb brushing against its cracked leather. He lifted it into the light, and for a breath, it seemed he might soften. But then his voice rang out, flat as iron. This proves nothing. At sundown, these children will be divided, and no more will be said on it. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Hester's knees buckled as though the ground had been pulled right out from beneath her. Calder caught her by the shoulder, his voice low but carrying across the entire square. Then, at sundown, he said, I'll stand before every man here, and I'll show them what law looks like when it burns a dead woman's memory to ash. I am Elias Redfeather. The West has known many duels fought with pistols at dawn, but none ever cut deeper than a duel fought with silence at sundown, where mercy stands armed only with truth. And as the sheriff closed the Bible and looped the chain tighter across his chest, the crowd leaned closer, waiting to see which would weigh heavier, the law's cold steel or one rancher's unbreakable defiance. The sun slid behind the ridge, painting the sky in bruised colors as Calder guided the wagon back toward his ranch. The sheriff's decree clanged louder in his mind than the rattle of the wheels. Behind them, Merrick's riders trailed like vultures, never too near, but never far enough to let them forget. The children huddled in the wagon bed, their thin arms twined together, every jolt of the ruts a reminder of the chain that was waiting for them at dawn. When they reached the cabin, Calder lifted each one down, steady and deliberate, as if by slowing his hands he could somehow slow the march of judgment itself. Inside, the cabin walls smelled of wood smoke and dust. It was bare, save for a hearth and a worn table scarred with the marks of hard work. He set before them bread and milk, saved from his own dwindling stores. At first, the children only stared, their eyes wide, as if they were afraid the food was a mirage that would vanish if they reached for it. Then, hunger broke through. They ate in a desperate silence, crumbs scattering like prayers that had been answered too late. Jolie's cough rasped as he tried to swallow, and Hester, without a thought, tore her own piece of bread in half to help him, even as her own lips were cracked with thirst. I am Elias Redfeather. Hunger is more than just emptiness in the belly. It gnaws at pride. It steals the memory of laughter until even a piece of stale bread tastes like a miracle. When the plates were clean, the firelight drew the small room into a circle of warmth. For the first time since they'd left the station, the children's shoulders began to ease. Calder fetched blankets from his own bed, tucking them around the smallest ones, his rough, calloused hands startlingly gentle. He crouched beside Hester, who still clutched the satchel like a shield, the blue ribbon trembling in her fingers. "What's inside there means more than paper to you," he said, his voice low and soft. Her eyes glistened in the firelight. She opened the flap just enough for him to see the cracked Bible. Its edges were frayed, its pages smudged with soot and tears. "Mama read to us from it every night," she whispered. "Even when she could hardly breathe, she read. When she died, we buried her with no stone. This is all that proves she was ours, and we were hers." Calder bowed his head, silent for a long moment. Then he rested his hand over hers on the book. "No man," he said, "has the right to burn what holds a family together." Bram, emboldened by the fire and the food, sat up straighter. "Will you fight them tomorrow?" he asked, his young voice trembling with the impossible weight of the answer. Calder's eyes flicked to the window, where the glimmer of distant torches could be seen on the ridge. Merrick's men were watching, waiting. "I'll stand between you and the fire," he said simply. The words were not promise enough for Lenny, who whispered, her voice barely audible. "But what if the sheriff takes it anyway? What if he burns it?" Calder did not look away from her. "Then I'll carry what's left, and still, you won't be alone." A deep silence wrapped the cabin then, broken only by the crackle of the flame and the soft, shallow breaths of children fighting sleep. Prue hummed a tune she barely remembered. Thatch counted the nails in the floorboards until his eyelids drooped, and Sol traced numbers into the dust with his finger, as if he could hold chaos at bay with simple arithmetic. Hester remained awake, her arms wound tight around the satchel, her lips moving in whispers too faint for even her brothers to hear. "I am Elias Redfeather. I once thought that prayers were meant to rise heavenward. But in truth, the strongest prayers are the ones whispered to those who are already gone, begging them not to leave us completely." Calder sat in the corner, his rifle across his lap, his eyes fixed on the flicker of torchlight beyond the ridge. Dawn would bring the square, the sheriff, and the chain. And he knew deep in his bones that mercy alone would not be enough to shield 7 children from a town so eager to divide them. As the fire burned low and the children finally drifted into an exhausted sleep, he tightened his grip on the rifle and whispered into the silence. "By sundown tomorrow, they'll know what it means to call a man's mercy madness." Dawn cracked pale and cold, the kind of light that doesn't warm but exposes. By the time Calder's wagon rolled into the town square, the church bell had already tolled once, calling neighbor against neighbor to witness judgment. The 7 children sat pressed together in the wagon bed, their faces chalk white with fear, the satchel in Hester's lap a fragile anchor in the coming storm. Every street emptied into the square until the crowd swelled thick, their whispers buzzing like angry hornets, eager to see whether law would finally break mercy in the full light of day. Sheriff Brandt stood on the courthouse steps, the partition chain coiled heavy over his arm, its tin tags gleaming like teeth. He raised a hand and his voice carried over the crowd. This matter is plain. 7 children, no kin, no papers, no deed. The county claims them, and by law they must be divided for their own survival. The murmurs swelled, some nodding in agreement, others looking away in shame. Merrick Cole shoved his way to the front, loud as a rooster at sunrise. "Sheriff, you know my acres. You know my need. I claim the 3 oldest, Hester, Bram, and Sol. They'll be working my fence lines by noon. The others can scatter as is fit." His words rang with the confidence of a man who believes he has already won, and a knot of men shouted their approval, eager for an order that would cost them nothing. Calder climbed down from the wagon, his boots sounding like hammer blows against the wooden boards. He turned and lifted the children down, one by one, lining them up at his side. Jolie clung to his collar, coughing into the fabric of his shirt, but Calder's arms stayed steady as rock. "They are not fence posts," he said, his voice even but sharp as a drawn blade. "They are not freight to be tallied by weight. For 3 days this town let them starve, and only now do you speak of their survival. I am Elias Red Feather. There are times when truth doesn't need to roar. It needs only to be said where all can hear, so that no man may later claim he did not know." The sheriff shifted on his feet, discomfort stirring behind the shine of his badge, but he held the chain firm. "The law stands, Reed. Mercy cannot govern a county." Calder's silence lasted just long enough to make men uneasy. Then he stepped aside, gesturing for Hester to come forward. Her knees trembled as she clutched the satchel, but she lifted it high, pulling the Bible into the light, the faded ribbon trembling like a banner in the morning air. "This is Mama's," she said, her voice thin, but carrying to every corner of the square. "She read it to us until she couldn't breathe no more, and when she died, she gave it to me. This is our proof. We're hers, and we belong together." The crowd hushed, their eyes fixed on the worn leather, on the stitched cross that shone faintly in the sun. Some of the women lowered their heads. Some of the men shuffled their feet as though a stone had just been dropped into their chests. Merrick broke the silence with a bark of laughter. "A book don't make kin. If that's all they've got, toss it to the fire and be done with it. Better ashes than more mouths to feed." His words slashed the quiet, and a ripple of shame followed. Sheriff Brandt took the Bible from her, his thumb brushing the cover. For a moment his jaw tightened, as though he felt the weight of more than just leather in his hand. But then his face hardened, and his voice went cold. "This is not proof of claim. This is paper. The law demands more." Gasps rippled outward. Hester staggered as if she'd been struck, clutching the ribbon back to her chest when he tried to hand the book down. Calder's eyes darkened, his body a solid wall between the sheriff and the children. "I am Elias Red Feather. I have seen men laugh at mercy. I have seen men burn it. But I have never seen it bow willingly. And that day I knew it would not bow to fire without a fight." The sheriff lifted the Bible high, his hand drifting toward the torch that smoked at the edge of the square. The children cried out as one, their voices breaking the morning stillness. The crowd leaned forward, breathless, waiting to see if justice would be silenced by flame. The torch at the edge of the square spat sparks into the morning air, its smoke curling like a serpent toward the Bible clutched in the sheriff's grip. The crowd pressed closer, some hungry for the cleansing fire, others shivering at the thought of burning a dead woman's last gift to her children. Merrick Cole thrust his hand toward the flame, his voice cutting sharp and cruel. "Do it, Sheriff. Burn it and end this farce. No book feeds bellies. No ribbon keeps strays alive. Strip Reed of his pride and give me what I've claimed." The children whimpered in unison, a single heartbreaking sound. Hester stumbled forward, her thin arms outstretched, her voice cracking. "Please, please don't take her from us twice. Mama gave us this when the ground took her body. It's all we have left to prove we were hers." Her knees buckled, and she fell against Calder's side, clutching the ribbon until her fingers bled pale. But her eyes never left the book. "I am Elias Redfeather." A child's plea is sharper than any lawyer's tongue, for it cuts right through pride and lands deep in the marrow of every man who still remembers his own mother's voice. The sheriff's hand trembled, the firelight flickering against the sweat on his brow. Yet his mouth still formed words of iron. "Dead women leave no deeds. The county cannot bend the law for sentiment." Merrick grinned wide, striding nearer. "You hear her confession. They've no proof, no kin, no worth. Give them over and let me put them to work before the week is out." Calder stepped forward then, his voice carrying across the square, low but thunderous. "What they carry is not paper. It is blood. It is sweat. It is memory. It is their name. You burn it, and you burn the truth of who they are." He turned his gaze on the crowd, his eyes sweeping over the faces that had jeered at him only yesterday. "How many of you," he called out, "buried your own mothers with nothing but dirt for a stone? How many of you carry a scrap of ribbon, a faded hymn, a single verse as proof that you belonged to someone once? Would you let that burn today and still call yourselves men?" A murmur spread like wind through dry grass. Women clutched their shawls tighter. Old men shifted their weight, guilt flickering in their eyes. Even Agnes Pike, thin as thread, raised her voice. "That ribbon is mine. I stitched it for the clinic. If it found its way here, then someone profited off the sick, and these children are carrying the proof. If you burn that Bible, you burn the evidence of theft." Gasps rippled through the square. The crowd's hunger for flame faltered, turning into uneasy suspicion. Merrick snarled, shoving past a farmer. "Lies from a spinster." "The chain waits, Sheriff. Don't you falter now." He reached toward the children, his hand shaped like a claw. Bram stepped forward, planting his small body between Merrick and his sisters, his fists trembling but raised. "We're not yours," he shouted, his voice thin but piercing through the noise. "We belong to her, and now we belong to him." He jerked his chin toward Calder. The boy's raw defiance jolted the crowd. A silence fell, heavy as stone. "I am Elias Redfeather, and I tell you, no sermon ever preached louder than that child's frail shout, for in it stood a truth that no torch could ever consume." The sheriff froze, the Bible in one hand, the chain in the other, his face caught in a battle between law and conscience. The crowd's murmur rose to a demand, some still urging him to burn it, others now hissing for restraint. And in that fevered, uncertain moment, Merrick lunged, his fingers grasping for the ribbon, spittle flying from his lips as he roared, "They're mine or they're no man's!" Calder caught his wrist in midair. The strength of his grip halted Merrick cold. The crowd gasped, women clutching their children, men stepping back. The sheriff's eyes widened, torn between duty and dread. The fire spat higher, its smoke curling like judgment itself. And there the square hung, suspended between flame and mercy, every soul holding their breath, waiting to see if the Bible would fall to ash, or if one man's grip could still turn the tide of an entire town. The sheriff's hand shook as if the weight of the Bible scorched hotter than the torch itself, his badge glinting like a false sun as the crowd surged in restless waves. Marek snarled, twisting in Calder's iron grip, spittle at his lips. His free hand clawed for the ribboned satchel that Prue clutched to her chest with the desperate strength of a drowning soul. "You can't hold them, Reed," Marek spat, his voice ragged with fury. "The law will chain them, and I'll work them till they break." Calder's silence finally cracked. His voice rose in a roar that startled even the horses tethered nearby. "No law can chain what love has already claimed." His grip wrenched Marek's arm back, sending the man sprawling into the dust, his curses swallowed by the collective gasp of the crowd. "I am Elias Redfeather. I have seen gunfights that ended quicker than that single moment, for nothing kills a man's pride faster than a mercy that absolutely refuses to kneel." Calder stepped forward, his boots hammering against the boards, and seized the Bible from the sheriff's trembling hand in one swift motion. Sparks flew as the torch licked close, but the leather did not catch. Instead, the sight of the rancher lifting it high above his head stilled the entire square. "This is not paper," Calder thundered. "This is a mother's voice, her proof, her blessing. It is a chain stronger than any iron. You burn it, and you burn yourselves." The children surged toward him, their small hands clinging to his coat, their eyes bright with a mixture of fear and absolute wonder, as though they had just seen a giant rise in their defense. Marek staggered to his feet, his face red with humiliation, his breath coming in ragged growls. "You'll hang for this, Reed. Blood or not, they're not yours. When the county hears of this, they'll strip you of your herd and your land." Calder lowered the Bible into Hester's trembling hands, his eyes on her as though he were passing down not just words, but an inheritance of defiance. "Blood doesn't make a family," he said, his voice like iron being driven into solid oak. "Love does. And I'll stand against every man here before I let you tear that truth apart." The words cut through the square, sharper than any bullet, and the silence that followed was heavier than any chain. The sheriff lowered his gaze, shame etched in every line of his face. His hand slipped from the revolver at his hip. Some of the women began to weep softly. The men shifted their weight as if their boots were suddenly pressing against sharp stones. Agnes Pike's thin voice rose again, trembling but clear. "He speaks the truth. We left them to starve, and he fed them. We shunned them, and he lifted them all. What right have we to take them now?" Marek spun on her with venom in his eyes. "Old fool, your stitches don't bind the law." But this time no one moved to laugh with him. His grin faltered, crumbling like dry clay in a sudden rain. And in that collapse all of his strength bled away into silence. "I am Elias Redfeather." A crowd turns faster than a river in a flood. Mockery one breath, shame the next. And I tell you, that day, shame was the stronger current. Calder placed his hand over Hester's on the Bible and looked once more to the sheriff. "Choose now, fire or mercy. But know this, if you choose fire, you'll have to burn me first." The crowd held its breath. The torch sputtered low. And in the heartbeat that followed, the whole town knew that mercy, once it had been lifted that high, would not bow to ash. The morning sun crept higher, spilling gold across the square, as if the heavens themselves wished to witness the verdict. And in that light, Sheriff Brandt's shoulders sagged. The chain slipped from his arm and clattered against the boards, the sound of law surrendering to something older, something truer. His hand, once rigid with judgment, now hung limp at his side. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked like dry wood. "Take them, Reed. If the county calls it theft, then let it call me guilty too." A murmur swept the crowd, first shock, then a wave of profound relief, and finally a deep shame that settled in the throats of those who had jeered the loudest. Merrick Cole roared in protest, lunging again, but this time no man stepped aside for him. Instead, hands that had once been idle now pressed against his chest, shoving him back. Faces that had been eager for his laughter now turned away, and the sneer that had carried him so far in this town collapsed completely into silence. I am Elias Redfeather. I have watched pride be undone by bullet and by rope, but never have I seen it fall faster than when an entire town turned its eyes to the dirt rather than share a man's shame. Calder knelt before the children, his hands steady as he lifted the Bible and pressed it fully into Hester's arms. "This is yours," he said, his voice low but sure. "It always was, and no man here will ever try to burn it again." Hester's tears finally came, streaking the coal dust from her face. She whispered, "Why? Why did you fight for us when you didn't even know our names?" Calder's jaw softened, and his voice carried across the hush of the square. "Because you waited for 3 days, and you still held on to each other. Because you carried her memory when no one else would. Because mercy is worth more than land." The children pressed against him then. Bram's fists finally unclenched as he gripped Calder's coat. Lenny wrapped her arms around his neck. Jolie coughed, but he was smiling faintly as his tiny hand touched the scorched leather of the Bible. The youngest whispered a single word, fragile but unbroken: "Father." And then the others echoed it, their voices rising together like a hymn that had been unsung for far too long. Merrick spat dust and mounted his horse, his curses trailing behind him like smoke as he fled. A man defeated not by bullets, but by a mercy that refused to bow. The sheriff unpinned his badge, held it out for a moment as if it weighed more than iron, then tucked it away without another word. He stepped aside. The crowd began to disperse in silence, no one daring to meet Calder's eyes, for they knew they had witnessed not weakness, but a strength too rare for any of them to claim as their own. Calder gathered the children into the wagon once more, setting the Bible at its center. Its blue ribbon fluttered in the morning breeze like a banner of defiance and grace. As he took up the reins, Hester leaned close, her voice steady now. "We'll never wait hungry on a platform again." Calder nodded, his gaze fixed on the wide-open horizon. "From this day forward," he said, "you are mine, and I am yours." The wagon rolled away, dust rising behind it, like a veil of blessing, and the sound of 7 voices whispering, "Father," followed it down the road until it blended with the wind itself. "I am Elias Redfeather." And so it was, in the year when law tried to weigh children like cattle and failed, that a rancher lifted 7 souls in his arms and carried them into a life that could never again be divided. This story, like the land itself, will remain long after we are all gone. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true-hearted tales from the past. That old Bible carried their mother's voice, and in the end, it saved them all. Let me ask you this. If you had been in that square with the torch raised high, would you have stepped forward to protect it too? Let me know in the comments below.